Hi there, my name is Peter Gurry. I teach New Testament here at Phoenix Seminary, where I also co-direct the Text and Canon Institute. This video is going to be a presentation that I gave at SBL in 2023 on the future of text types. If history is the story of change, as is often said, then textual history is a story of textual change. Whether that story is described with liquid metaphors like textual streams and flows, or with family metaphors with ancestors and descendants, or with material metaphors of deterioration and restoration, it's a story of how one form of the text led to another. Telling that story and telling it well has been essential to textual criticism for a very long time. And text types in particular have been a crucial way the New Testament scholars have told that story. Though the notion of textual groupings has a long pedigree, the term text type became dominant only in the mid-20th century. To see just how important they have been, we can look to Bruce Metzger's still very popular textual commentary, which I have a copy of here. And here the importance of text types can be appreciated from the fact that it has more references to the three main text types than the book has pages. Now, this hardly surprises, given that the introduction to this book makes text types central to explaining the history of the text and to the practice of textual criticism. And in so doing, it's a good illustration of Eldon Epp's observation that, quote, to write the history of the New Testament text is to write the history of text types, and concomitantly to write also the history of the criteria for the priority of readings, end quote. Text types have been indispensable to telling the history of the New Testament text and to determining the priority of readings. So briefly, what I want to do in this talk is talk about text types as a past solution, a present problem, and then make some suggestions for progress on this question. So in the first instance, let's talk about text types as a solution. Any consideration of the topic must ask why this category of text types has loomed so large and for so long in the discipline. And the main reason I would suggest is found in their ability to solve two problems that mark out the New Testament as nearly peerless among ancient textual traditions. The first is numbers. For the New Testament, we have hundreds of manuscripts for Revelation and thousands of manuscripts for the Gospels. That's just in Greek, of course. So the numbers is the first one. The second one is what we call contamination. We have manuscripts that have more than one ancestor. So because of these two problems, New Testament scholars have not been able to use more traditional methods of relating manuscripts to judge their textual value, the way classicists have. New Testament scholars have had to use a different approach, one described well in a quote on your slide there from Martin West. Martin West was a classical textual critic, and in his little book, Textual Criticism and Editorial Technique, which I have a copy of here as well, you can see, he writes this on page 7. He says, when the critic has established that no stemma can be constructed, how is he to proceed? He must, of course, first, I'm adding the numbers here, he must first see what groupings are apparent among the manuscripts, and two, whether the individual groups can be analyzed stemmatically. And then he goes on to say that even if they cannot, that is, even if they cannot be analyzed stemmatically, three, the text critic must treat them as units in his further cogitations, provided that they have a sharply defined identity. Thus, he reduces his problem to its basic terms. In other words, where the textual tradition does not allow for a stemma of manuscripts, the scholar can still proceed by trying to produce a stemma of groups of manuscripts. And this, of course, is exactly what Westcott and Hort did when they identified four main textual groups, what they called the neutral, the Alexandrian, the Western, and the Syrian, or what today is usually called Byzantine. And then what they did is they related those four groups in such a way that allowed them to eliminate the distinctive readings of their Syrian, or again, what we would call the Byzantine text. Now, this still left them with several competing texts to assess. Then at that point, Westcott and Hort exemplified West's final suggestion by treating the groups as units and assigning them general qualities like, in their terms, a love of paraphrase, is how they describe the Western text, or a delicate philological tact for the Alexandria, and a lucidity and completeness that they use to describe the Syrian or Byzantine. And in this, Westcott and Hort illustrate the main purpose of text types. They reduce the problem we face as New Testament textual critics. None of us can keep distinct evaluations or relations of hundreds of manuscripts straight in our heads. But if we can reduce these hundreds to just 3 or 4 groupings, then, to quote a famous British scholar of the 20th century, every textual task you undertake becomes a piece of cake. With only 3 or 4 groups to think about, we can evaluate them and relate them with far greater ease. So that I would suggest is how text types have been a solution. And now what I want to talk about is how text types have been a problem. Because the solution then is what I described before. It allows you to reduce the problem. But for this to work, the textual groups must be distinct. To return to Martin West, he says clearly that such manuscript groupings are useful, quote, provided that they have a sharply defined identity. If the text of Codex W, for example, is not treated as partly Alexandrian and partly Western, as has been traditional, but instead is treated as a third entity entirely, then its value for the scholar must shift accordingly. And so the recurring problem for text types is this crucial one of definition. Westcott and Hort, for example, never gave a strict definition for their texts, nor did they provide the full data behind them. This is probably, I think, because they didn't feel that they needed to. After all, their major textual groups had the benefit of a fairly long precedent. But in any case, the problem of definition was nowhere emphasized or addressed more clearly than in a work of another scholar, E.C. Caldwell. In his seminal studies on method, he repeatedly addressed the question of textual groups. As early as 1947, he called for what he said was a new theory and method to clarify, quote, the concept of text or text type. And he warned of the deception hiding within the little word text when it was ill-defined. In subsequent essays, Caldwell answered his own call. In the first place, he distinguished different kinds of groups. For the largest group of manuscripts, he reserved the label text type on the one end. At the opposite end of the spectrum was what he called a family, or, quote, the smallest identifiable group. And then he further identified a tribe as laying somewhere in between these polar opposites. Now, not many people have followed up on his use of tribe, but text type and family are still familiar categories today. And he gave a well-known definition of text type as, quote, a group of manuscripts that agree more than 70% of the time and is separated by a gap of about 10% from its neighbors. This is his sort of famous 70-10 definition. And here at last was a precise, measurable definition that promised to provide Martin West's sharply defined identity for these groups. But unfortunately, his definition did not last. With the discovery of more manuscripts, the completion of larger collations, and above all, the inclusion of more data in those collations, the numbers did not hold. As an example, you might look at Larry Hurtado's work on the Caesarean text compared to two traditionally key members, Codex W and T, or 038, and he found that only 36.9% agreement between them in Mark chapter 10. This was out of 103 points of comparison between the two. The most recent data from the ECM, by the way, compares the two in the same chapter at 418 points and results in a 77.9% agreement, which is still relatively low for Mark manuscripts. More recently, Klaus Wachtel has argued that the reason Caldwell's definition of a text type does not work is because he simply excluded too much data from too many witnesses. When more data from more witnesses are included, Caldwell's criteria begin to break down and the groups dissipate. As a result, the ECM, or the Editio Critica Maior editors, have explicitly moved away from using text types, writing that in the case of Acts, quote, the present edition dispenses with a theory of two texts of Acts. The Mark volume likewise says that although the traditional text types do share distinct readings, the complete data, quote, shows that the relationship between the witnesses examined here is too complex to be adequately represented by a text type model. In short, more data has resulted in less coherence within the traditional text types. To take one example, Metzger lists P45, a primary Alexandrian witness in Acts. And here on the slide, you can see the 10 closest relatives for P45 according to the ECM data, right? And what you see from this table is a decreasing number of percentage agreement, right? But the percentage agreement is very slight. It tapers off, but very, very slowly by only points of percentages as you go on. So it starts with BO3 at 86.5 agreement, and at least on my table here, I've ended at 307. The table, of course, continues to go on long after this. Of these manuscripts, Metzger lists all but 1642, 1739, and 307 as Alexandrian in the book of Acts. Minuscule 1739 is listed as Western, whereas the other two are not discussed at all. Now, except for 1739, the data from the ECM might seem to confirm Metzger's divisions. The problem is that the list here on my slide keeps going, and the percentage agreement decreases at basically the same rate until finally one reaches Codex Beza at the very bottom. With such small margins, the question is simply this: where should we make the cutoff? Which manuscripts are part of the same text type as P45 and Acts, and how does one decide? Any line that one would draw on this table would seem to be arbitrary. Now, against these critiques, Eldon Epp has ventured the most significant events to date of textual groupings, which he prefers to call textual clusters. In my opinion, how different this new concept really is somewhat debatable. He still retains 4 clusters, each one corresponding to the traditional 4, with many of the same witnesses assigned to each. But be that as it may, by far his most important objection to the current doubts about text types is that they do not account for the versional or patristic evidence, two things that have been indispensable, historically speaking, in identifying text types. Significantly, at least in the case of the Western text, Klaus Wachtel has conceded the point here, that the versional and patristic evidence is really important and needs to be seriously considered as we discuss this issue of text types. So Epp is concerned about the lack of certain data. On the other hand, he is also concerned with using too much data. The ECM is quite expansive in its data, including the shortest of variants and singular readings. And we could contrast this with Caldwell, who explicitly excludes readings which he says, quote, occur commonly in manuscripts as a result of scribal error or habit, end quote. And he also excludes singular readings. In John 11, for example, this first qualification gets Caldwell down to just 205 places of comparison, and the second one brings him down to 100 places. Needless to say, Caldwell is leaving a good deal of data on the table, and he would say, rightly so. But not all agree. What matters for Epp is not agreement in everything. He does not want to count agreements in textual minutiae, similar to Caldwell. Instead, he wants to compare places where, quote, the same idea is being expressed, regardless of the language, and in spite of minor differences, end quote. The importance of this difference in what to count can be illustrated by comparing two manuscripts, P127 and D05, in the two methods. P127 has been of special interest since its initial publication because of its agreement with Codex Beza, or D05. A major question has been whether it should be considered part of the so-called Western text, or to use Epp's term, the D cluster. In Epp's recent work, P127 is included along with 67 variation units, and the results show it to be a primary witness to the D text. In the ECM data used by the CBGM, D and P127 are comparable at 363 places, and they agree in only 50.1% of them. Now that is obviously a stark difference, and shows just how different the results can be depending on exactly what we count and compare. As Georg Gabel says in a very careful but still partial study of the topic, he says, quote, questions of methodology gain considerable importance, and depending on the methods chosen, scholars arrive at substantially different results, end quote. Perhaps nowhere is this reality on display more than in the case of the Western text in Acts. So what I'd like to do now in the last part of this paper is make some suggestions for progress on this question of methodology and how we handle text types. In the first place, my first suggestion is we must be careful how we define texts. This is the central issue. It is one of definition. Caldwell helpfully provided a statistical definition to distinguish text types from each other. But as we've seen, very few have been able to make his numbers work in practice. Eldon Epp's more recent defense of clusters ends by admitting the problem without offering a solution. Even before the problem of defining the borders between groups is the problem of using the same agreement levels within groups. In Klaus Wachtel's comparison of the witnesses in the traditional 4 text types in Mark, and this is in the ECM volume here, this is in part 3, studies, all right? He says the Alexandrian witnesses barely reach 90% agreement with each other, whereas the Byzantine witnesses never fall below 93%, with some reaching as high as 98%. I have a slide here. You can see his table. Those numbers may be too small for you to see on the screen, but this is from page 4. You can see the table here in my volume here. Again, this is in the ECM volume. This is in part 3, the studies volume. The supposed Caesarean witnesses were in the low 80th or upper 70th percentile. On what grounds, then, are these groups actually compatible entities if their intra-group agreement is so different? It begins to look like a case of comparing apples to oranges when you look at these numbers. Our definitions matter because one definition may show the complete opposite result from another. This is what I found in my own dissertation when I worked on the Harklian group. So we must be clear about what the text is that we are arguing for or against when we talk about text types. One thing that seems certain is that vague definitions will not survive in the era of big data. So the first thing we need to do is be very careful about our definitions. Secondly, I would suggest that we need to clarify the purpose. If defining what we mean by text types is essential, we must also recognize that such definitions depend on what we want text types to do for us. This returns us to the question with which we began. What are text types for? Epp, as I mentioned, is very clear on this point. He is most interested in ideas and stories, especially when it comes to the text of Acts. For him, the value of defining different text types is how they reflect different Christian groups that produced and read them. Now, whatever one thinks of his particular goal, it is different than that of Westcott and Hort, who used text types not to tell stories, but to reduce the complexity of evaluating so many manuscripts. Judging by commentaries, this is what many New Testament scholars also want to use text types for. It's interesting to note here that the two most recent editions, the ECM and the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, don't even appeal to text types in their approach to editing the text. It's just a minor note in passing. All right, so second, clarify the purpose. Thirdly, and lastly, I think we need to do better at specifying the relationship. It must be remembered that all New Testament manuscripts are related to each other by virtue of being New Testament manuscripts. Now, this may sound stupidly obvious, but I think it is often forgotten in this discussion about text types. We are not, for instance, asking whether Codex Beza is related to P127. Of course they are related. They are both manuscripts of the same literary work, after all. They're both copies of Acts. And in this, they are also related to every other copy of Acts too. The question we are really after is whether P127 is related to D in a way it isn't related to other manuscripts, and if so, what this might mean for the history of the text of Acts. In other words, we have to be specific about the kind of relations we are interested in when we talk about text types. All New Testament witnesses are related somehow. The question of text types is how. So in conclusion, perhaps the advent of computer-assisted methods has brought us back to Caldwell, who wrote in 1947 that, quote, "Our dilemma seems to be that we know too much to believe the old. We do not yet know enough to create the new." There seems to be a growing awareness among text critics that the old notion of text types will not work. There is unfortunately no agreed definition for them, either historically or statistically, and new methods and tools have challenged previous conceptions. In 2000, Eldon Epp wrote that the question of text types presented one of the major issues facing the discipline as it entered the 21st century. 2 decades now into the 21st century, and Epp's words are even more true. As I close, let me borrow inspiration from Epp's analogy when he suggests that we think of textual groups as being more like galaxies than constellations. Like the stars in the night sky, there is no doubt that we have a great many manuscripts, and that they all occupy space together. What we make of their relationship to each other forces us to ask whether we have used them more like a sailor navigating by the stars, or more like a banker using astrology to buy stocks. With better telescopes than ever, I think the time is ripe not only to look at the heavens again, but to also assess how we use what we find there when we look. Last thing, let me mention in closing that this is not just a hypothetical thing of wanting to push the discussion forward, but here at the Text and Canon Institute, we're excited to announce that this July of 2024, we're going to be hosting a colloquium bringing together 11 speakers to address this problem of text types in New Testament textual criticism. It's going to be held at Yarnton Manor in Oxford, I think it's about 15 miles outside of Oxford. Thankfully, we have room for attendees, so if you are interested in this topic and would like to come and participate in the discussion, please go to our website at textandcanon.org/texttypes with a dash in between, and you can register there. Registration is now open. We would love to have you there. We're hoping it's a fruitful conversation as we discuss what is one of the most important subjects in our discipline, and one that is the subject of a lot of discussion as we've talked about. So thank you very much.